We all know that Vince McMahon was the first promoter to bring wrestling to a national platform. He'd buy TV slots away from local promotions and really invested in expanding via cable TV. You also may know that Bill Watts and Jim Crockett would follow suit. But did you know that Vince wasn't the first to attempt a national expansion? In fact, someone tried to do it a whole decade earlier, and they even stepped on Vince Sr.'s toes in the process. This is the story of the International Wrestling Association. Their story is the first official entry in my series, Defunct Championship Wrestling.
International Championship Wrestling, featuring the superstars of professional wrestling.
The story of the IWA actually begins with three men in two different companies. The first is the father and son pair of Pedro and Ron Martinez. Pedro Martinez was a former wrestler and at this point was the promoter of the Cleveland and Buffalo territories for the NWA. In 1969, he would break away, citing the financial obligation to the alliance. When running shows, the NWA would take 10% of the gate revenue, 8% going to the world's champion, and 2% going to the governing body itself. So, Pedro decided to go it on his own and started the National Wrestling Federation. The NWF featured many notable names from the time, like Ernie Ladd, Johnny Valentine, and the Mongols. His son Ron would start out in the business as a kid selling programs and eventually become the NWF ring announcer at 16. Ron would later become the interviewer, commentator, and booker for his dad as well. Not only did Ron love pro wrestling, but he was also a dedicated basketball fan, specifically college ball. This was the early 1970s, pre-ESPN, pre-March Madness being the phenomenon it is today. There wasn't one giant network airing these games nationally, but there was a series of networks airing these games. In fact, the broadcast credited with sparking interest in college basketball, the game of the century between the Houston Cougars and UCLA Bruins in 1968, was aired live on the little-known TVS family of stations. The TVS television network was owned by Eddie Einhorn, our third man in this trifecta. Einhorn worked out deals that saw his TVS sports packages aired on local UHF channels, all across the country. He used those networks to air mostly sports you may not have seen elsewhere at the time: college basketball, pro tennis, arm wrestling. Pretty much anything you may see on ESPN2 now was a TVS specialty. Einhorn was also a wrestling fan, and saw a chance to take advantage with his network of local stations and create a pro wrestling company for the whole country. He'd seen the ratings that local wrestling shows were doing and knew the appetite was there. It's unclear how, but at some point Ron Martinez and Eddie Einhorn met and struck up a friendship. This led Ron to introduce Einhorn to his dad, NWF promoter Pedro. Einhorn and Ron Martinez knew that with the TVS footprint and their wrestling connections, the three of them could bring pro wrestling to a national audience. So, in 1975, NWF closed its doors and the three men started the International Wrestling Association. But in order for this to work, they needed stars. Obviously, some were skeptical. The trio tried to sign George Scott away from the Crockett's North Carolina to be their booker, but he declined. However, they were able to sign some stars to give them an international flair. Ivan Koloff, fresh off a run in New York where he stunned the MSG crowd when he defeated Bruno. There was no better Soviet heel in 1975. The Love Brothers, the mainstay tag heels of the promotion, found their way down from the Tunnies in Toronto and spent some time in the wild Detroit area for the Sheik. Victor Rivera. The first strike against the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, Rivera jumped ship to the IWA while still one half of the World Tag Team Champions. And arguably their biggest star, Mil Mascaras, the greatest and most famous luchador of all time. He'd become the centerpiece for the company and their only world champion. These signings, along with NWF regulars like Ernie Ladd, Ox Baker, and Mighty Igor, created a diverse and eye-catching roster. How could this upstart promotion in the middle of the country bring all these eclectic talents together? Simple. Money. Guaranteed money. While commonplace now, having any sort of guaranteed pay was unheard of in wrestling at the time. Whether you worked 5 days a month or 30, you got paid. Food and hotels were also covered, which even today isn't always the case with national companies. Einhorn invested over $1 million at the start to ensure that talents were taken care of and happy. Now that the roster was built and paid, it was time to land TV spots. Einhorn got to work selling his wrestling show, International Championship Wrestling, to local affiliates, packaging it with other sports offerings. If a channel wanted, say, college basketball, they had to air IWA wrestling. This forced many stations to drop the existing wrestling that they already aired. In fact, this is exactly what happened with WWOR in New York, which dropped, you guessed it, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, forcing the McMahons to air on Spanish-language channels to maintain their visibility in the New York-New Jersey market. This strategy worked and got them on the air in 16 markets, from New York to Los Angeles. They were on the air coast to coast. By March of 1975, the IWA were ready to start running shows, debuting in the heart of Crockett Country, Charlotte, North Carolina. From there, they'd move into running in Florida, back to Cleveland, into Virginia, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and yes, New York City. Obviously, the promoters of these areas weren't keen on having competition. They'd leave threatening messages at the IWA office and try to sabotage their events. The Crockett's even entered into exclusive deals with the larger arenas in their mid-Atlantic region, leaving the IWA to run smaller venues. And in July of '75, when the group was first running Roosevelt Stadium in New Jersey, the McMahons sent wrestlers to the event to disrupt proceedings, salty that the young company had filled the place with 13,000 fans. Einhorn and Martinez weren't going to lay there and take that level of disrespect. So, in an attempt at retaliation, they sent manager George Cannon to try to convince George the Animal Steele to no-show his upcoming match against Bruno Sammartino and jump ship to IWA. Steele declined. By the end of the year, fed up with the sabotage and losing so much money, Einhorn dropped out of IWA. This left Ron and Pedro Martinez to run a much more scaled-back version of the promotion. They continued to run shows with much less star power and exposure, settled in the Carolinas and Virginia, pitting them against the Crockett's once again. In 1977, IWA would file an antitrust lawsuit against the Crockett's, running what would become their final event in April that year. They would lose the suit and the International Wrestling Association would shut down operations in 1978. While the promotion may have closed, their memory would live on through the years. The IWA footage was heavily used in the documentary The Unreal Story of Professional Wrestling, featured on A&E in 1998. This was how I first saw the IWA footage, and was introduced to George Crybaby Cannon with this wonderful edit.
Professional wrestling is a form of theater, not so unlike Shakespearean theater, and I also know that in his own day, Shakespeare was condemned for writing dramas that appealed only to the uninitiated audience. Real artists wrote poetry, not drama.
You've never seen Eric use that doubters?
Are you another one of those who stand up and criticize? Are you another one of those who are aiming in a conspiracy to say that Eric the Red does use his bone?
Now that you mention it, it does sound like Shakespeare.
The IWA would again find its way to a new audience via the ESPN classic series Cheap Seats with the Sklar brothers. The pair watched the promotion in several episodes where they made fun of odd sporting events from ESPN's early years. I actually liked the show a lot back in the day and always enjoyed their take on the weird little wrestling show I'd never heard of.
Mighty Igor looks like that guy at your gym who screams at the barbells and doesn't bring his own towel.
Today, the IWA footage is under the Wrestling Legends Network umbrella, where it's a major part of their streaming service, as well as, fittingly enough, their syndicated classic all-star wrestling TV show, which I DVR every episode and try to watch every Saturday and Sunday morning. Pedro Martinez would pass away in 1998. His son Ron would go on to become a safari tour guide in Africa for several years. He also started a home video distributor called PM Films and Videotape Company, a venture he used to release tapes of all the old territory footage he spent years collecting. Some say he amassed a collection that was only rivaled by WWE's. He would pass away in 2010. Mil Mascaras never lost the IWA World Championship. He actually would spend the next several decades defending the title. Eddie Einhorn would join CBS Sports and become the vice chairman of the Chicago White Sox, and even got back into wrestling when he invested in Pro Wrestling USA. But that's a story for another time. He would pass away in 2016. The International Wrestling Association may have failed, but many of its innovations are still felt today. Guaranteed money, instant replay, and slow-mo of moves were all brought to wrestling through IWA. And the very concept of a national wrestling promotion and how it could be done starts with them. Eddie Einhorn was asked in 2013 about the juggernaut that college basketball had become, and I think his response also works for his foray into wrestling. "I didn't know it would ever get this big," he said, "but it shows I was right." I'm Scott from WrestleSpective, thanks to Slam Wrestling and Ring the Damn Bell, whose articles were key in researching this video. And thank you for watching. Comment what territory or other failed promotion you'd like to see me cover in this series. Until next time, watch wrestling. It's the best.